Hi there, welcome to a roundtable discussion about equality, diversity and inclusion, or ED&I. This is a continuation of our previous videos from the Scout project, exploring themes, topics and issues experienced within the SMEs of Scotland, but obviously this can be stretched out to the UK and worldwide. The Scout project is a collaboration of CPI, CMAC and IBIIC to help and support Scottish SMEs developing disruptive or innovative technologies within the chemical, life science and manufacturing industries. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the panel, and I will go around the screen and let everybody introduce themselves briefly.
I'm Ian Archer, I'm the Technical Director at the Industrial Biotech Innovation Centre.
Hi there, I'm Alison Robinson. I am the Business Development and Translation Manager for the CMAC Research Centre at the University of Strathclyde.
Hi, I'm Damien Mohammed. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Manager for CPI.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, so we've got a few questions to ask, and I'll kick things off and I'll just go by top of the screen in order. So Ian, what are your organisation's current priorities in the ED&I space?
So I'm responsible for our skills programme at IBIIC, which is everything from STEM activities through to HND and apprentices and master's programme, and quite a large PhD programme. So we've got 70 current PhD students, 120 started since 2014. So the priorities really are about ensuring wide and diverse access to all of those programs and finding the best ways of doing it.
And Alison, would you like to expand on that at all, in your beliefs?
Yeah, so priorities are somewhat similar to Ian. Again, we are a research centre within the University of Strathclyde, and as part of that we have full-time staff, academics, we have a cohort of PDRAs and we have a cohort of PhD students as well. So embedding fair and inclusive processes across all areas of our business is really important to us. I would say from the space that we occupy, of the more protected characteristics, the ones that are more enshrined in law, gender is a big focus for us. Being more manufacturing focused, there's often a skewing towards more male than there is in female in the area that we work in, so we have a particular eye on that as well.
Brilliant. And Damien, is there anything else you'd like to add to that? I know you're not from the HR department from CPI, so from your own personal experience.
Yeah, so EDI for me is kind of a personal passion. It's not kind of part of my main job function, but it's just something that I'm passionate about and kind of keen to instill in every single company that I've worked for in the past and look to in the future. What I love about what's happening at CPI at the moment, we're part of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, which is part of the wider Catapult network, which kind of works under Innovate UK, which have got a inclusivity and innovation charter that we've signed up to. So it's really important that the company that we work for has an understanding about what's important about creating an inclusive environment within STEM, which again, as just highlighted earlier, is a quite important thing within science and technology. Is quite difficult often to get that diversity. So it's really important that people have these things in place, not just from an individual employer perspective and for employees, but also for the wider supply chain that they work with too.
That's great, and that kind of leads us on to another question that we have there. So how would you define the value of having an ED&I focus within an organisation?
Yes, so as I said, I think often EDI is looked at as kind of for employers. So it's from the HR team. It's important to have a diverse workforce, but also I think it goes wider than that. So previous companies that I've worked for is, yes, it's great to have those things, but actually the purpose of having them is actually to also attract people from diverse places. So a company that I worked at previously, they was a very undiverse team when I joined. And just by myself joining from an ethnic minority background and also employing someone that was a female manager as well, we attracted way more people to come and work with us. So we're an investment team. I think we increased the investments up to something like 50% of businesses that got investment from our team were female founded. And that wasn't because we were specifically looking for them. I think it's because people felt more comfortable in coming to pitch to us for their investments, and then also had similar sort of thing within BAME founded business. So people from an ethnic minority background starting businesses were more comfortable in coming to us because they felt the people that we're talking to actually understand them a little bit more and able to do that. So I think it's yes, it's fantastic to do it because it's the right thing to do, but it's also great for a business to have that diversity within the company to attract more people and to also have a different way of thinking internally. So I think that's also important. People come from different backgrounds, whether that's socioeconomic class, whether that's gender, whether it's sexuality. People think slightly differently from different walks of life. So that also makes you have a much richer understanding of the marketplace, and also then helps you make better decisions, I believe.
I couldn't agree more with that, Damien. I think there's something, aside from it being the right thing to do, there are some huge benefits to it, right? There's one of my favorite books is a book called Messy by Tim Harford, which is like a massive celebration of diversity in a very broad sense. And there is countless examples in that book of times where just having different people in the room leads to a better solution, because you just get different thoughts coming in, you know, from a very technical perspective. I mean, my old job, I used to work with a lot of molecular biologists and chemists and microbiologists, and so this is not a protected characteristic example of a diversity. But if you've got 3 molecular biologists discussing how to do something, adding a 4th one into that group doesn't really add much value. But you bring in a chemist or an engineer or a business person, or frankly someone off the street, you probably get a different viewpoint. And so that to me is, and as I say, Tim Harford's book Messy is just chock full of stuff like that. It's well worth a read.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree. I mean, there's economic papers from people like McKinsey, Harvard Business Review, that show that innovation and economic prosperity does thrive in a much more diverse environment. So there's a very good business driver in there. If you're wanting to grow your investment, to grow your business, the best place to do that is within a diverse environment. So it really should be enshrined in all businesses and values if they want to prosper for the future.
In what way do you try to encourage a more diverse group of people to come to your organisations?
Yeah, so maybe echoing something that Damien had said as well around hiring and retention and recruitment. I think if you have a workforce that is very visibly reflecting the society or reflecting the diversity that you yourself want to have, it's setting up those role models, it's setting up that reflective piece that it looks like this is a company that's for you, or this is a sector that you can join if you can see others in there too. If you come from a minority group, you think, well, that's a door that's been open to them, that should hopefully be a door that's open to me as well. So I guess having a more diverse workforce, you have to be mindful of the backgrounds that they do come from and not overuse their lived experience. Very often people from minority backgrounds, when they come into a new workplace, yes, they're very often asked about that experience so that the business can try and put that to better use. But I would also argue that you need to also have allies that are prepared to work with them as well to make sure that these values are fully embedded across the organisation and don't just fall on the shoulders of 1 or 2 individuals.
Yeah, and I think it very much is, we've discussed it before, you want to have this balancing kind of act of, you don't want it to be, as you said, tokenistic. It's not a ticking box exercise, and it has to be completely natural, free and face-to-face value. So I totally get that. And Ian, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, in terms of kind of what you need to do in terms of bringing people into your organisation, one of the things that's really important is looking for what's not there. It's sometimes easy to it's easy enough to review who's applied for positions, for example, or how you might be advertising. But as a really good example that I saw, again, this is relating to PhD programs actually, but one of the London doctoral training programs, the Lido doctoral training program, looked at their applicants and recognised that only 3% of applications came from what they described as the non-research intensive universities. So for people of my age, those were universities that became universities in 1992, and prior to that were polytechnics. And what they saw in those is that, you know, they're not particularly research intensive. So students in those universities don't really see research as a career necessarily. They don't see that as an option for where to go next. So not very many of them were applying to the program, the training program. But then the Lido guys also recognised that those universities tend to be much more ethnically diverse, more socio-economically diverse in terms of their, frankly, the students who are there are poorer than the ones who go to the Russell Group universities. And so there's a kind of really big gap. And I think what was clever was they recognized this was missing. These applications, it wasn't that they were looking at, these applications just weren't turning up on their doorstep. And so they created a program for students in their, just going into their final year of uni, to come and do research, 10-week or 12-week research programs in the universities, in the more research-intensive universities in London, just to get a taster for doing research, to see what it was like. And so they paid them living wage, because it's quite a challenging place to live in London. And these students came in and they saw their applications from those universities go from 3% to 8% over the course of 1 year. It was remarkable. And so I think that's the sort of thing I think is really clever, where someone has actually managed to look, and it's not like looking at what is turning up and then doing an analysis of how many women apply, how many what the ethnic breakdown of your applicants are. It's actually looking actively, going out and looking for something that isn't there, which is quite difficult to do. But if you find good examples of it, I think they should be shared.
And do you think these programs are maybe more widespread now than the university programs and campuses, or do you think we should be moving this whole discussion earlier, and it should be when people are discussing their choices at school and so on as well, where they want to go?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think you have to start as early as possible. I think there's, lots of bias where, even just right as toddlers, shops, don't they segregate off different toys from different genders. So you're talking about going even further back. But yes, to focus on schools, I think for sure it's worth encouraging all sorts of diversity, and not really thinking about, well, maths isn't really for girls or anything like that. I think, everything's out there for everyone to take advantage of. And I think those sorts of stereotypes and bias are really unhelpful. And by the time you do get to university, to similar PhD programs that Ian was referring to, a lot of that thinking's entrenched, or it's narrowed off people's choices because they've not had the educational opportunities presented to them because of that bias. So yeah, for sure, I think we should be starting as early as possible.
For me, it's what we talked about earlier about representation. If you don't see lots of female scientists on TV, because you probably often don't, you maybe aspire to be someone that is a bit more in the public eye, so people kind of in the celebrity world or singers and things. That's when you speak to kids at an early age, they want to be like that person because they see them on TV and aspire to be that. If we were to see more people in STEM roles, maybe on TV or even just in general, like you don't necessarily see that. My boss goes in to speak to schools. She's a scientist herself by background, but also now works with CPI, working in the strategic partnerships that I work in. And she goes in and talks to them on what's their favorite subject, science. What do you want to be when you grow up? Hairdresser. Because there's not that, you don't see those things necessarily on there. So I think some of the things that we've done, we've opened up an office in Darlington, but it's right in the city centre, not in a business park in the middle of nowhere, which a lot of our other offices are, because people can't see those. But it's purposely in the city centre, a for access, but also to inspire. Like we've got glass walls, not glass ceiling, but glass walls as well. I think this is really important because what past and see people from different backgrounds, female, male, different genders, different ethnicity, actually doing scientific things, and they've got doctors, the scientific jackets on, and they go, oh, that's exciting what they're doing in there, and they can have a look in. And it's really important to inspire people from really early age that they can be anything they want to be. But unless we kind of show them what they could be, they won't see that. And going in and doing talks and explaining what their role is and showing how exciting it is and how we can help create vaccines that are going to save millions of lives and all these different things that we could do within science and technology. So I think having that early stage space is that conversation early on is really, really important.
An interesting way to think about it is this idea of science capital. I think we've come across that before, that the vast majority of people have actually haven't had any science experience probably since they were 15, if they were, and most people, we talk here as if this is kind of normal, but most folk have never been into a lab that wasn't a school lab, and probably for a long time before that. It's a very unusual thing to do, actually. It's a bit strange. So that, and for some people, like me as an example, my mum was a chemistry teacher, my dad's a scientist as well, academic scientist. So it was easy for me. Frankly, they were the easy subjects for me at school. I took it. I was a little bit lazy, if I'm honest. I should have, if I was braver, I'd have gone and done something different, but I didn't. So I had plenty of science capital, so this was a relatively easy path for me. But for most people, it isn't, and it's even more difficult. Given if you do come from a more difficult background. So I think that idea of thinking about science capital and trying to raise the science capital, just giving people that experience, is a really useful way to think about this.
I'm a father of two, and then at school you have your STEM ambassadors at school and so on that try to maybe just talk about things, and visibility and experience is everything, because as you said, coming from different family backgrounds, a lot of people look to their parents to see what did you do, or their siblings to see what did they do at school, and they're very heavily influenced in that way. So I totally get that, and the STEM ambassadors I think are just as one of the great tools now used.
It's worth remembering that STEM activities are very labour intensive. It takes a lot of resource to do it. If you need to, there's a lot of primary schools around. There's a huge number of primary schools, and it's not just turning up one afternoon and hoping that you've just inspired a Nobel Prize winner. You've got to keep going for a long time. So I think that's the challenge here. It needs an awful lot of effort and resource, and obviously money there as well. So, but clever programs that help you deliver that are good. So we've done one that I really like, which was created by a woman who's now at Edinburgh University, Jo Sadler, called Leaders in Science. And it works really well for this. So what we do there is we take some of our maybe a couple of our PhD students will go into a high school. So high school kids who are in their final year, so year 13 in England, we call it sixth year here, obviously. But it's those sixth years then develop programs that they can then go and deliver in primary school. So what we end up with is like two of our PhD students effectively then train maybe a dozen sixth years, and then they go and deliver these programs to several hundred children. So it's like a little pyramid selling scheme, basically. So it's a really efficient way of using a small amount of resource and managing to create opportunities for loads of kids. So I really like that as a program, but you need stuff like that because it is so resource intensive to get into high schools, because there's just so many of them.
And Alison, as a female on the table, would you like to maybe discuss what the barriers you've experienced being female and moving into this industry?
Yeah, so I mean, I did a PhD in chemistry, so that was, physical sciences. It was, full of blokes and full of male teachers. So, there's not very many people that you can identify, but basically, if it doesn't sound terribly geeky, like the love of the subject, just sort of powered you on through it, I guess, and it made it enjoyable for it to do. I think laterally, more working actually, funnily enough, in business development and working particularly in the pharmaceutical manufacturing, it's the gender disparity is very much more obvious as well. And I would say as a woman, you do have to fight to have your voice heard at the table and to put yourself forward that little bit more, because there's a lot more imbalance in terms of gender in this particular sector as well. So that is a challenge, and it's something you're very mindful of. You're very mindful as well of smaller sort of microaggressions, or women getting given what's called non-promotable tasks, for example. You're very much given things that you don't think that a man would be as well. So, and it's one of those things that once you're aware of them, and you don't kind of lean into that. You kind of like try and very much plough your own path, and you have to think twice, but it does take an awful lot more labour to think about what you're being asked to do as an employee, maybe compared to your male counterpart as well. So it's an interesting space to be in.
I had a friend of mine recently I had to chat to who was talking about those non-promotable tasks. I think that's a really interesting point. He actually said he works in kind of financial sector, but he said they actually ask him his appraisal each year, what's he done that's in around that sort of non-promote. So it seems a positive thing in there. And actually, if you want to get if you don't want to get a good appraisal, you've got to demonstrate that you've done it, done something that's not just part of the stuff you're supposed to get paid for.
It's a tricky balance for sure, and I think definitely if we think of CMAC as being part of that academic landscape as well, there's a lot of service tasks. Academia does work an awful lot on free labour, and you do really have to question what you sign up to do, and there's definitely a gender dimension in there as well between what you could do and what does get seen as non-promotable, or as you say, Ian, potentially a promotable task, because it is seen to be good to be part of that wider network. But I think there's very definitely a gender lens that people would see it through, and you just have to be careful between, is this really contributing towards something? Am I being fairly rewarded? Or is it something that you're being given to do because you are the woman? So it's an interesting one.
Do you see this improving at all over time, or are we taking steps backwards, or are we going forwards?
I don't think we're going backwards. I don't know if we're moving forwards quickly on it, but I would say there's a lot more awareness, basically, because, you know, we're obviously sitting here talking about it today, which might not have happened 10 years ago. There's for sure more policies about it, and there's more dialogue about it. I think quite often, though, you have to get past the policies and the dialogue and start putting it into action. And I think that is slower. That is a harder task because it is so maybe much more culturally entrenched that it takes longer to change like hearts and minds, I would say. So it's definitely not going backwards. I just don't know that it's going forwards full speed.
I think it's really interesting you've got a name for it now. We have a name for it now, because that's a good step forward, right? And you've identified. Yeah. I read an article about this about a month ago, and before that I'd never heard that task, the expression non-promotable task. I'm like, oh, okay, now I know what it is. I can look for it. And then you're quite right, you see it. Maybe I don't get offered them. I don't get told I'm supposed to do them in the same way, but with a name for it helps, right? Because at least you can recognize when it's happening now. So yeah,
for sure, absolutely.
I think people always look at the D of the ED&I and not much about the equality and the inclusion. So they'll say, oh, we'll need to have more of a diverse workforce or more diverse supply chain. And those sorts of things, they aren't really important, but I think then giving someone a role over someone else because of their gender or their ethnicity is just as bad as it was before. It's almost sometimes goes the other way. So it's about equality. So making sure everyone is on an equal level playing field, and whatever walk of life they're from, whether that's again, gender, diversity and ethnicity, or even stuff like I think it's really important with neurodiversity. So people that might think slightly different, but also making them feel included within it. So that's the inclusion bit again. So the D stands out a lot, and I think it's people know about the diversity and know that that's an important thing. They need to have a diverse team, not just at a junior level as well, by the way. It's going up to the senior level, and board representation I think is super important, but not just doing it, making sure that person adds value to that team, to that discussion. But again, the inclusion and making people feel included within the workforce because of their differences sometimes, but also opportunity for someone else because of that too. So again, that equality piece. So I think they're the really important things that are happening. So I think people are still struggling with what ED&I means, and are doing that diversity piece because it's a good thing to do and we should be doing it. But I think what needs to happen in the future is the equality and the inclusion bit. I think that needs a bit of work.
I heard quite a nice description of this last week. I don't know if Damien, what you think of this, but a woman I heard speaking at a panel session last week on diversity. She said that diversity was being invited to the party, but inclusion was being asked to dance, which I thought was quite a cool way of putting it. And I think again, it's really important to kind of, because it's too easy to just let all EDI just trip off your tongue and forget what the different words mean, but they're not the same. And actually, and I thought it was, to me, I hope it wasn't trivializing it, but I thought it was quite a cool way of thinking about it. Yeah, I did. I thought it was good.
Yeah, funnily enough that you say that, Ian, I saw a report this morning as well, and it was saying exactly the same thing, because they'd done an analysis of board papers, and they'd looked, and yes, these boards were very diverse, but the number of times that the person who would be in your minority category, the number of times they were given the opportunity to speak or felt empowered to speak up was much lower than the other voices at the table as well, who were maybe more sort of traditional.
But you've got to actively manage it, Alison, right? That's the whole point. It's not something that just happens just because you've got this group of people together. You actually got to make sure you use it.
Yeah,
I think one thing I'm also cautious of as things are progressing, and they are progressing in the right direction. I think there's going to be kind of ups and downs in how things progress, but I think quotas I'm really concerned of. I'm seeing that sometimes, and again, that's box ticking, that's tokenism, and it's for the sake of it. So we haven't got enough black people that work for us. So let's try and get some more. But that's not how things should be, because we need to look at quotas. It should be about opening up that conversation to a much wider audience and see who can get involved and who can add value in certain different areas. So I think people need to be really, really cautious of putting in certain, say, percentages of workforce or percentages of suppliers. I used to work with a company based in London called Minority Supply Diversity UK, and in the US they have to have a certain percentage of diverse suppliers, so female founded businesses in their supply chain, or ethnic minority founded businesses, disabled founded businesses, because to work with the government you have to have that, and then all the other supply chain it trickles down to. I'm really not a big fan of any sort of percentages, whether it is within the employees and the workforce, or whether it's in the supply chain and things. I think that's a thing that hopefully the UK doesn't move towards in the future, because I think that has quite a negative impact.
And that really flows into the kind of next question. It's like, so what advice and tips would you give to the SMEs on how to embed these ED&I practices and help it to grow their business?
Yeah, I was obviously thinking about this before the call, and I think it's something that we've all kind of touched on indirectly, is around resourcing, basically. This is quite labour intensive, and I can imagine for SMEs who might not have an awful lot of resource to give to it, that is going to be an issue. So I would say, look at what you have, be realistic about what you can achieve. There isn't any point in over-promising, because then you're going to exclude people as well, because you're not going to be able to make good on the promises you've made to that particular grouping. So I would say be very realistic about the resources that you have and the goals that you want to have. Why do you want to have these? Why do you want to create a diverse workforce, and what are you going to do for them to make things, as we say, more equal and more inclusive once you have them within your business as well? So I think it is about being reflective and taking a really good look at yourselves and your business and where you want your workforce to go, in order to work backwards almost to embed the good practice and to see what you can actually do.
Our experience, we run our conference every year, and we make a big deal of trying to get a good gender balance in our conference, and the speakers and the chairs and everything. And what I've noticed with that, within IBOIC, we're not an SME directly, we work with a lot of SMEs. It's basically making sure it's not an afterthought. That's one of the first things. It's like you're doing this now. So at the start of the process, or the start of your thinking, so it's just part of your thinking is like, we make sure there is some balance in here. Champions are really good as well. When I think to companies that I think have got the right approach here, there's often one or two people in the company that who are just quite charismatic and who take this very seriously and make it something that's seen as something very positive, as opposed to the kind of box ticking exercise that happens at the end, where you just check, hang on a minute, let's just make sure that we've included the right number of women or whatever other minorities in this particular list. So that and the champions are good there, but it has to be done in that. Champions are champions because they bring some kind of positivity to everything. It's not about berating people, it's about making this something that's seen as really valuable in its own right. So everyone just does it anyway. That's the key bit. It's like you don't want it to be the thing that's the add-on at the end. It's just part of your natural thinking.
Yeah, I think early on when you're setting out the kind of plans for the business, surrounding yourself with different people from different walks of life. And again, we don't have to just talk about the protected characteristics. There are other things outside of there as well, around kind of socioeconomic background as well. I think it's really important. And neurodiversity, which I mentioned too, I think is also important. But making sure you have those people around you in those early days when you're shaping what the company might look like. So having mentors, advisors, non-exec directors, people like that that have been maybe from a different country and see how the world works, rather than the little bubble that you're kind of living within your city, wherever you've kind of grown up, and actually helping you think a little bit different, because things might not always work everywhere else. So when you look to internationalize your business potentially, as you get bigger, that different markets don't always work the same way, and you have to think slightly differently. The pricing might be differently, the pace of business might be differently, how business meetings are held in different countries are quite different often. So you go to China, it's kind of holding the card with two hands, and that's kind of how you greet. There's different ways of things to be aware of as a business when you're starting out. You're not necessarily aware of those. So again, surrounding yourself by different people, they don't have to be necessarily employees of yours, but just being in a wider business world to help you understand the intricacies of how to get that business from here to here. And that's really, really important as an SME to do that.
I think another point from earlier as well that was mentioned is a lot of this is, what's described as like a journey. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to be, at your destination, very quickly. It is going to take an awful lot of time. So, give yourselves that time, educate and work out what it is that's important to you, what's important to your sector, to your customers, to your workforce, and just be honest that it will be a journey and it will take a little bit of time to get there, and it's not going to happen overnight.
And I think there's a few things that a few kind of specific tips and tricks you can give people as well that are quite nice. So I do some, again, apologies for coming back to PhDs again, I do some recruitment for PhDs at East Bio, which is one of the big doctoral training programs in Scotland, and they had everything. Well, it turns out now they've been strong in EDI, trying to work hard on their EDI policies and their intake over the last few years. But as a result, now 75% of the applicants have got some protected characteristic, which kind of seems to defeat the object a little bit when 75% of the people have got It makes it difficult to use that as any kind of decision making. But one of the things they had recently that they brought into it was first in family to go to university, which I thought was a really interesting one. It was really clever. So if you're looking to recruit someone, that's maybe an interesting characteristic. I think quite how you do it we can ask that specifically when it's PhDs. Maybe you wouldn't, it'd be more difficult to do it as an SME looking to recruit. But it's an interesting way of finding people who are going to think a bit differently. But I do also think you then have to be quite careful how you then gauge someone or measure someone or interview someone against in those circumstances. So if you have got someone like that coming in, they might not seem as polished when it comes to an interview as somebody who's been to, let's say, a very expensive private school where they've been trained in that kind of thing, and they might be a bit different for that. So you have to give them that kind of, you also have to take it beyond just the initial shortlisting and give people a slightly different approach. So, your questions need to be looking, if you're going to ask them questions in an interview, they've got to be looking to explore what someone's thinking and how, what they're like, rather than necessarily how they come across. It's all very well, I could complain it's terribly unfair that I'm not allowed to compete in the 100 meters. And people might at the Olympics, and the Olympic people might say, "Oh yeah, I'll go on, Ian. Yeah, you're right. You need to be able to compete." There's not a lot of point in putting me up against Usain Bolt, though. You have to give me a 90-meter head start to have a chance of winning that race, right? So, and I think that's important. It's not just. I don't think it's fair, having done that, to then expect everybody to be exactly the same or perform against the same criteria in the interviews. Mm-hmm. So that's a challenge. But I think these kind of specific tips and tricks are what we all need to be getting in here, because it's all very well to talk at a very general level, but it's like understanding what that really means when you're looking at recruitment and inclusivity. That's why I like that thing about diversity being invited to the party and inclusion being asked to dance. It's a kind of really interesting way to think about it,
My personal experience actually being at CPI, I think the majority of people that apply for roles I work for us have either science or PhD or something background, and I personally don't. I've come from more kind of creative background. I've done a lot of kind of marketing things, but that allows me to think slightly different to everyone else. So I'm adding value in a completely different direction. If I need the scientific background and support, I can go to my colleagues that have those things, and then we can kind of work together as a team. And it allows more collaboration because people have different ways of thinking, which then work together. So it benefits everyone. I think it was great that the fact that even though I think the job spec said desired PhD or scientific background, which I didn't, and I spoke to the recruiters before I went for it. So it's more important to me applying for this because I haven't got that background. What I do have is this, and this. I have connections. I have understanding of how things work, ecosystems, understanding of innovation, etc., and those things allowed me to come to the party, and then obviously got the role, and that's what I'm doing now. And I think I add a different scope to the team as a whole, but also to the company, and to be even involved in these conversations we're having now around EDI. If I necessarily wasn't interested in this, then I wouldn't have kind of had this conversation with you guys. So I think it's really important to do that.
It really is giving everybody the chance to flourish. We've all came from different backgrounds and paths and so on. It's appreciating that everybody is different in different ways, but it's just really also giving them the chance to grow. So where would you see in the ideal world, the ideal situation in like 10 years' time?
Well, I'm going to come back to my PhD program again, and a stat that we noticed recently in our numbers, that only 30% of the PIs, so the supervisors of these PhD students, are female, which is not a bad number actually. In relative terms, actually 30% isn't too bad. It's not great, but it's probably better than it could be. It's pretty better than some subjects. And remember, this is biotech, so it's biology focused, but more than 50% of our PhD students are female. So I'm kind of hoping that sort of thing alone should carry through into a slightly different situation. I also suspect that there isn't a single one of any of those PhD students who would disagree with anything we've said here today. So all of them are coming through, and they're all going to be like tomorrow's leaders. So let's hope it's going to be different from that. I hope it is, and I can certainly see it in our sector, just because more than 50% of those students are female now. So that is going to make a difference when we get to that point. I'm not going to try and claim any credit for actively managing that. I suspect we're just lucky in some ways because we're biology-focused science, and there tend to be more women in biology-focused science than as Alison said before, in chemistry-focused science. So things are definitely moving in the right direction. I do think we have to be a little careful from a political perspective, because these are the kind of things that become very easy for culture wars to be fought around. And I think the current political situation is pretty unpleasant, and it's quite easy to find, I could imagine, current culture war-based politics become actually actively fighting against some of this. But like Damien was talking about earlier on, things like quotas and that kind of thing, which we probably are not a good idea. But I do worry that there's the way that politics is going at the moment. It's pretty nasty. Some of it.
Yeah, I think that's like a really good point. I think, if you could look 10 years in the future, maybe more values-led organisations will have came a long way, and this, as you say, will be more the norm. But we don't live in isolation. We live, in a society that can sometimes be a little bit hostile, as we know, to some of these ideas, and it can, descend into culture wars. So it will be a very fine line to tread. So again, I would be hopeful for the future, but again, I think I would be like Ian and have that same note of caution around, does everyone share the same values as this as well? So how widespread is this going to be beyond particular organisations that are fully committed to it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think obviously there will be kind of polarized views. And you mentioned earlier, Kevin, about kind of generational thing. I think people of an older generation sometimes will find it sometimes a difficult conversation to have this sort of thing than someone younger. But as you say, in 10 years' time, those people would have maybe moved on, and then the new generation would have come up with new ideas and fresh ideas and make us like the older generation that have a different view to them. So it's always going to happen. I think there's always going to be an evolution of those conversations. I think we just need to be cautious that it doesn't go too far the wrong way, which then creates more division. I think that's really, really important. I think it's that equality and inclusion more than a diversity piece. I think is the most important thing, that people don't do things because they think they should do, and then it ends up just polarizing conversations internally and politically as well. So I think that's really important.
You said it right at the start, Damien. I think your point about the fact that diversity is it's not just the right thing to do, but it's inherently going to lead to better results, right? And it
absolutely, yeah,
genuinely does. Obviously, you need to be inclusive as well as diversity, but that to me feels like they're the only way to balance against that kind of culture war. It's like this is a good thing because it does benefits. It really is genuinely a positive thing to do.
Yeah, Kevin and I had that conversation the other day, didn't we, about kind of profitability and things, and about internally selling things into kind of senior level people. Often it comes back to what's the reason for it, other than it just being a good thing to do. It's about what else can it add to the bottom line, etc. Because it generally does. It's the conversations that we have are more diverse conversations naturally. Therefore, we might think differently. We might move into a different market. We might launch a new product because we didn't even realize that product was needed in that, because we're not surrounded by people from that background. So again, it adds value. It adds innovation, because again, the whole point I started before about what we're doing as a company is inclusivity and innovation, because more innovation will come from more diversity, and those things are really, really important, and then it makes you stand out from the rest of the crowd as well if you've got more of a diverse background, because you can come up with something that not everyone else has. So I think that's super important when selling that conversation internally to senior leadership within any organization, that those things will make you stand out and potentially will make you more successful as a business.
At the end of the day, I think we're all working together. We all have different opinions, views. We see things differently, and I think that is what the value is across the whole board. If we all are focused on the task in hand and not the individual person, I think we can all work better together.